My name is Andrea Grajeda. I'm doing the court case Loving versus Virginia 1967. This case is about interracial marriage not being legal in some states, of course, Virginia, in that time. The next slide is about miscegenation, a racist concept referring to the marriage or interbreeding among different races. This print is one of a series designed to outrage white people. It shows a future where racial hierarchies were reversed. It shows, you can see the white people serving the black people and interracial marriages. This was shocking for the time because at the time, Black Americans and white Americans did not socialize and they did not marry in public. Okay, so the next slide, which is miscegenation laws and court rulings. One of the earliest laws were the colony of Virginia enacts the first law punishing interracial marriage to prevent what it called the abominable mixture and spurious issue produced by unions between whites and non-whites. In 1833, Pace versus Alabama, Supreme Court ruled miscegenation law was constitutional. This will hold for 80 years. In 1888, the Supreme Court rules that the states have authority to regulate marriage. In 1924, Virginia enacts this act to preserve racial integrity and makes interracial marriage illegal. In the 1950s, there's still more than 50% of laws restricting marriage by racial classifications. And then finally, the Loving versus Virginia, which happened in 1967, the Supreme Court rules that the freedom to marry of another race cannot be infringed by the state, striking down all the interracial marriage laws and the court's own precedent. So the next slide is Mildred and Richard Loving. These are the figures of the Loving and Virginia case, where Richard Loving and Mildred Jeter, a couple from the town of Central Point in Caroline County, Virginia, Richard, a white construction worker, and Mildred, a woman of mixed African-American race and Native ancestry, were longtime friends who'd fallen in love. And in June of 1958, they exchanged wedding vows in Washington, D.C., where interracial marriage was legal, and then returned to Virginia. On July 11th, 1958, just 5 weeks after their wedding, they were woken up in the middle of the night and arrested by the local sheriff. Richard and Mildred were indicted on charges of violating Virginia anti-miscegenation laws, which deemed interracial marriages a felony. When the couple pleaded guilty the following year, Judge Leon M. Basil sentenced them to 1 year in prison, but suspended that sentence on the condition that they would leave Virginia and not return together for a period of 25 years. So then the next slide is about the Loving family. Following their court case, the Lovings were forced to leave Virginia and relocate to Washington, D.C. The couple lived in exile in the nation's capital for 7 years and raised 3 children, sons Sidney and Donald, and a daughter, Peggy. However, the Lovings wanted to return to their hometown of Virginia. The Lovings began their legal battle in November of 1963. A desperate Mildred Loving wrote a letter to the U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, asking for assistance. So Kennedy referred the Lovings to the American Civil Liberties Union, which agreed to take their case. Next slide shows Loving versus Virginia Supreme Court case. With the help of Bernard Cohen and Philip Hirschkopf, 2 young ACLU lawyers, the couple filed a motion asking for Judge Basil to vacate their conviction and set aside their sentence. When Basil refused, Cohen and Hirschkopf took the case to the Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals, but the court upheld the original ruling. Following another appeal, the case made its way to the U.S. Supreme Court in April of 1967. During oral arguments before the Supreme Court, Virginia's Assistant Attorney General Robert D. McWane III defended the constitutionality of his state's anti-miscegenation law and compared it to similar regulations against incest and polygamy. Cohen and Hirkop, meanwhile, argued the Virginia statute was illegal under the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which guarantees all citizens due process and equal protection under the law. Okay, so the next slide is Loving versus Virginia Supreme Court. During one now famous exchange, Hirkop stated that Virginia interracial marriage law and others like it were rooted in racism and white supremacy. These are not health and welfare laws, he argued. These are slavery laws, pure and simple. The Supreme Court announced its ruling in Loving versus Virginia on June 12, 1967. In the unanimous decision, the justices found that Virginia's interracial marriage law violated the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. Under our Constitution, the freedom to marry or not marry a person of another race resides with the individual and cannot be infringed by the state. Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote, "The landmark ruling not only overturned the Loving 1958 criminal conviction, it also struck down laws against interracial marriage in 15 other U.S. states." So then the next slide is my conclusion. The Supreme Court found that the Virginia miscegenation law violated the 14th Amendment of the Constitution and ruled that marriage as a fundamental and inherent right that could not be denied to a couple of color. Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote in the unanimous decision, "There can no doubt the restricting the freedom to marry solely because of racial classifications violates the central meaning of the Equal Protection Clause. The Lovings secretly lived on Virginia's farm for much over the legal battle. But after the Supreme Court decision, they returned to the town of Central Point to raise their 3 children. Richard Loving was killed 7 years after the court's decision in 1975 by a drunk driver in the Caroline County, which struck the couple's car. Mildred survived the crash and went on to spend the rest of her life in Central Point. She died in 2008, having never married again. Then the next slide. This is the legacy, the Loving versus Virginia legacy. Loving versus Virginia is considered one of the most significant legal decisions of the civil rights era. By declaring Virginia's anti-miscegenation law unconstitutional, the Supreme Court ended prohibitions on interracial marriage and dealt a major blow to segregation. So this was a major blow to segregation, which was really good for civil rights. Despite the court's decision, however, some states were slow to alter their laws. The last state to officially accept the ruling was Alabama, which only removed an anti-miscegenation statute from its state constitution in 2000. In addition to its implications for interracial marriage, Loving versus Virginia was also invoked in subsequent court cases concerning same-sex marriages. In 2015, for example, Justice Anthony Kennedy cited the Loving case in his opinion on the Supreme Court case Obergefell versus Hodges, which legalized gay marriage across the United States. June 12th is the anniversary of the Loving versus Virginia decision and now is commemorated each year as Loving Day, a holiday celebrating interracial couples. So the 14th Amendment of the Constitution states, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. Okay, and that it concludes my presentation on the Loving versus Virginia case. Thank you.